view has continued to revise up the global economic growth in the last few years. So will you continue to do so?
I'm confident that we will not revise down, and that we are fairly positive about the continuation of growth as we see it.
It seems to me that the IMF becomes a little bit optimistic of the global economy as well as the United States economy. But some people are concerned about that some pro-cyclical actions like the tax reform and maybe the possible infrastructure investment in the United States. And people worry that this kind of the pro-cyclical actions maybe speed up the growth and recovery and end this cycle early. So does IMF share the concern or not?
You know, there are various elements of the tax reform that we are supporting and that we have advocated for a long time. You know, simplification and alignment of the corporate tax rate to a more OECD average-like is certainly something that we have encouraged. To the extent that there is no compensation to the revenue reduction, then it will produce an impact on growth by way of stimulating the economy, which is already at full potential. So that could certainly stimulate inflation as well, to a point where we will have tightening of the monetary policy, to a point where possibly that will have an impact on financing costs around the world and have an impact also on the appreciation of the US dollar, although that is very uncertain. So all of that will have spillover impact outside the United States, and I think that all countries have to just anticipate that potential effect and have to guard against it by rebuilding their buffers, having space in order to possibly resist the risk of increased financing in economies that are currently largely leveraged, both at the public level as well as at the corporate level. So I think what I said back in October, which is that when the sun is shining, in other words, when there is growth, it's time to fix the roof, is even more true today than it was back in October. And our recommendation will certainly be to continue to rebuild buffers, make sure that debt is put back into at least a stabilized, if not declining, path, and that structural reforms are continued by pretty much all countries.
Yeah, I think that we should seize opportunity to fix the roof, but at the same time, the Fed role becomes more and more important. And you mentioned that a possible rate hike when the economic growth becomes very good in the United States. But we also have a risk if the Fed have the rate hike too quickly, then it risks to make the bubble burst early, maybe. And also it is worry from a lot of people like Ray Dalio, and they are expecting kind of recession and even financial crisis down the road. Are they too pessimistic?
You cannot have it all. In other words, when you have growth picking up and when you have an improvement of the economic situation, necessarily the monetary policy is going to tighten. And what we hope will happen is, as we have had it in the last couple of years, a well-communicated and empirically founded determination of rates going forward. We hope that that will continue to be the case.
And the capital market, and especially equity market, is very vulnerable and today because of the trade friction kind of a message. Then the market will up and down very quickly. Then the Fed move may have impact on the equity market, and also China and also other big emerging market information will have a big impact on the equity market in the United States, because a lot of people are believing that there's bubble there. Are you concerned about the equity market in the United States?
Volatility is a factor of the improvement of economic circumstances. Yeah. So, as I said, you cannot have it all. You cannot have significant growth, financing terms that continue to be easy, and no volatility. So, As the situation improves, all people operating on the markets, because that's what you're interested in, have to get used to this renewed volatility and a system that is going to be tightened from a monetary policy point of view. Now, markets have moved in February. They have functioned reasonably well. There was liquidity. So we are no longer in the sort of immediately post-crisis tempo where there was very little volatility, very limited growth, and quantitative easing. We are moving clearly and shifting into a different paradigm that everybody has to get used to.
Let's talk a little bit about the analytical chapter of the view. I think it's very, very interesting topic, which is if we have a big share of the service in the GDP, then it may weigh on the productivity across the economy. And the view's answer is no. I think it's a very interesting topic. And what is your comment on that?
I think there are two conclusions from that particular chapter, which focuses on the traditional, conventional wisdom that you move from agriculture to manufacturing to services. And it makes 2 points. One is, it may very well be that the transition is very rapid from agriculture to services, with not necessarily a long sequence of manufacturing. Point number one. And that is perfectly compatible with point number two, the service sector that delivers significant productivity. So I think, drawing from these lessons, there are countries in the world which are emerging markets, which are low-income countries, that should be comforted by those findings.
And also back to China, because the service and manufacturing also mattered here, and we are trying to reform China quickly, and we try to open up more quickly, as indicated by the President Xi Jinping himself. So what are you concerned about China's big challenges? Because you have been advising China for a long time, and China have old challenges and new challenges, a lot of challenges. But which are the challenges concerns you most, and what should China do to cope with these challenges?
I would say that China has already addressed some of the key challenges, but it needs to continue to address them. And by that I mean reining in the credit that has been offered to the economy, either at the public or at the semi-public level. Second, address the situation of some of the state-owned enterprises to make sure that they are competitive, that they're not heavily subsidized, and that they can operate efficiently. Third, as I mentioned this morning in my address, I think there are gaps that China can close in order to be more open. What do I mean? There's the gap of what I call digital applied to finance. If that digital gap was closed, and if, more women were included in the financial sector, the countries that are less inclusive could be more inclusive, that would deliver additional growth. Second, I think on the regulatory front, there are some gaps that need to be filled. When you let fintechs develop massively, you suddenly realize that there are some activities that are not properly regulated. If people are of goodwill, that's fine. If you have badly intentioned people operating in those sectors, that can be a risk. And the systemic risks need to be anticipated, dealt with, and the regulatory gap needs to be filled.
Yeah. So you mean a fintech, if it's a financial service, it should be regulated as a financial industry as before. I'm not sure if you mean this.
What I mean is that there are good fintechs and there are dark fintechs. Okay? So the good fintechs should be encouraged. And they can facilitate transactions, they can reduce the cost, they can eliminate intermediaries, they can include people, they can enable better and more efficient remittances. But you have the dark side of it as well. And there is a lot of activity that is done through crypto assets or cryptocurrencies in order to facilitate anti-money laundering, the financing of terrorism, some dark trading that nobody would like to see happening. So I think it's in that respect that you need to have a proper regulatory system in place. In the same vein, You want to avoid the kind of Ponzi schemes that can flourish in some circumstances. Right. So the regulatory gap needs to be filled as well. And the third gap, which I want to conclude on, is the innovation gap. Innovation used in the past to belong to a few countries. It is now expanding much more to include Korea, Japan, China, where many of the robots are operating, right? So that innovation gap is closing, needs to continue to close, but it will only happen if trade continues, because trade is a facilitator of technology sharing.
And it's also the message from the VIO analytical chapter, chapter 4.
Sure.
And along this line, the technology plays a driving force, a big role here. But technology like the AI tomorrow will bring more problems into China, while giving the United States and also the whole world a lot of benefit, at the same time a lot of the challenges, say inequality of the income distribution, say unemployment, say maybe the ethic issue about the robotics. Maybe tomorrow robotics will have a right of the human being or machine right. So how do we adapt to this new kind of the world, coping with these challenges? It's kind of long view.
Education, 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 training, 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 in order to adjust to the changes that will happen as a result of technological progress. It's a story of humanity.
Right.
It feels that it's accelerating, so we need to accelerate the investment and the effort that we put into education and adjustment.
Yeah, and also we touch upon the cryptocurrency, and we know that the shift of the cryptocurrency move on to the central banking CBDC. So we know that the IMF also have some paper on the cryptocurrency, and including CBDC, central banking digital currency. So what is your message to the central bankers all over the world? Should we speed up the research, and also maybe we should bring CBDC into reality soon?
I think in that field there has to be cooperation. You don't want to have, holes in the regulatory framework that is in place. And that cooperation, I hope, will take place. It should allow for sufficient innovation without causing systemic risk on an overall basis. And we'll be very happy to participate in that process.
How could China to cope with this trade skirmish, and who maybe will be helpful here to help China and United States to stop or elevate the kind of trade war? And maybe IMF can make a role, G20 can make a role, or China, United States can finally have a negotiation.
I think you're right that there is this very significant transition of the growth model of China, and this renewed focus on domestic consumption, on less trade, less investment, is really an indication of a new shift that the country takes. I think China generally takes a long view and plays a long game as opposed to being focused in the short term. And in that context, to hear President Xi renewing his commitment to the multilateral system, renewing his commitment to respect the rule of law, to respect international trade, I think is very important. Whether that takes a new dressing, a new label, is another issue. But the substantive points that he made are really relevant. Certainly, we at the IMF, because we support prosperity, growth, stability, fueled notably by trade, we would hope that those frictions will be negotiated in fairness between the parties, so that trade can continue to be that very major engine for growth, that very major accelerator of technology sharing, as we have recently identified, And if we can help in that respect, we will be happy to help. But it's a matter that really needs to be decided by the authorities of the countries.
As United States tries to use a 301 investigation into China, then it opposed to the China 2025 manufacturing big plan. Then do you think the 301 investigation into China will have an impact, or we should, regardless of this, and continue our plan of the 2025 implementation, as you have said?
I would, in any event, very strongly support dialogue between the parties. If you have different players operating on the basis of their respective plans and never talking to each other, it's not a good outcome. A good outcome is when parties have a dialogue. There might be disagreement, there might be allegations that are actually based on reality, and that needs to be put on the table, debated, and discussed in accordance with the system that exists. If it is within the WTO competence and jurisdiction, it should be within WTO dispute resolution mechanism. If it is outside the scope of WTO, then it should be discussed between the parties, particularly when you're talking about the two largest economic power in the world.